I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow. I'm Garrett Salpeter, the founder of NeuFit, and I am so excited today to talk with you about neuroplasticity and specifically how we can harness the power of neuroplasticity to improve and restore physical function. When I think about this topic, I can't help but think of a woman named Wendy and her story. And Wendy has had MS for 30 years. In the last 10 years, it really started to impair and diminish her quality of life. And in the last 4, it got to the point where she became wheelchair bound, lost her driver's license, and needed a caregiver, and really started to have some serious impairments. So Wendy, fortunately, had found Dr. Wahls and the Wahls protocol and made progress with the Wahls protocol in terms of stopping the progression of her MS. So that's a big win. Stopping things from getting worse, sealing off against further damage is a big deal, and that's great. And then she was desperately trying to do things to regain and restore function, and that's where she got really frustrated because she was doing something meaningful every single day. She was doing a few days a week physical therapy sessions. She was doing a few days a week of working out with a local MS support group in the Milwaukee area where she lives. She was doing meaningful physical activity every day, but wasn't making any progress. So she was frustrated. She heard about us through Dr. Wahls and her materials and reached out to us. Finally decided to come down and see us about a year ago. And when she came down to see us, the first thing we talked about with her was basically just try to level set on where she is right now. So she's lost a lot of function, and there's basically 2 ways that she could possibly have any chance of restoring that function. The first is to repair the damage. If MS has attacked and damaged her myelin, think about possibly figuring out ways to repair that myelin. The other possible way to restore function would be to try to compensate for that damage. So if, for example, if she has impairments in her left hand because her right brain has been damaged and isn't working as well, then perhaps she could adopt strategies where her left brain, areas of her left brain might take over controlling her left hand. So that's an example of a compensatory strategy that MS patients often will make. Both repair and compensation are examples of neuroplasticity, and specifically, neuroplasticity is an adaptation to the input and the signals from the environment. So neuroplasticity is actually the ability of the nervous system to change, and it will change in response to these inputs and these signals, and the changes can be those two types that we just mentioned. It can either be rebuilding structures or remodeling structures in the nervous system, or they can be more compensatory changes, which would fit under the umbrella of functional reorganization. And neuroplasticity is also very specific, so it's kind of a double-edged sword where it can be good, which of course is what we're trying to do with Wendy. It can fall into this realm here. So if you're able to see the image, the green area in this. So just to give you a sense, particularly for those of you who are listening on audio only, the image here shows a graph where Wendy's at this baseline level of function before her MS symptoms really started to exacerbate, and then when MS hits, it declines sharply. So she drops down to this new baseline, much lower level of function and capacity, and then from there she basically has 3 choices. One is to do what she was doing, do some amount of work just to maintain that level. If she wasn't doing that, she would have fallen into the trap of learned disuse, where things would have actually gotten worse, this downside of neuroplasticity. So here on the image, there's this red triangle or wedge where she would continue to get worse from learned disuse. Use it or lose it really applies there. And then in green, there's this positive side of neuroplasticity, where if she can give herself enough of the right kind of input, she can actually improve and restore some of her function. There's a great sentence that summarizes the specificity that this nature of neuroplasticity, to say that we always adapt to exactly what we're doing. That tells us that the adaptations can be good or bad, and if we do enough of the right things, there's a good chance that those adaptations will be more positive. There's evidence specifically for both types of positive neuroplastic changes, and there's a list of references here that we'll share in the notes how you can access. So a couple of studies that show, for example, the possibility of remyelination. So there is evidence that it's possible to remyelinate. Typically that new myelin sheath, for those of you who don't know what that is typically the target where the immune system in an autoimmune reaction, the inflammatory processes attack the myelin sheath. That's the insulation around these neurological pathways that helps ensure accuracy and speed of transmission. And when that's eaten away or damaged by the MS disease process, that dramatically impairs nervous system function. So it is possible to rebuild some myelin, even though the new sheath is typically thinner. It still is effective at insulating that and ensuring the quality and speed of transmission along those nerve pathways. And there's evidence that shows that it's mediated by numerous cellular genetic mechanisms, and so it just tells us that it takes a lot of input to trigger all of these different things to happen appropriately in the body. There's also evidence for the functional reorganization. So there's one concept here called long-term potentiation that's important, and this describes how we build habits and patterns in the nervous system. And there's a good quote here that says nerves or neurons that fire together wire together, and this describes how when we do things a couple times, it might take some intention and effort in the beginning, but as we do them repeatedly, the nervous system actually creates connections that allows that to happen with less energy and effort in the future, and that's how we build habits and patterns. And of course, we can have good habits, we can have bad habits. It's just a reflection of getting better at what we're doing. So there's a specific component to that. And then there's also examples of remapping the brain, where there's some very interesting examples. In MS, we talked about how, for example, if Wendy's left hand was impaired, her left brain might take over where the right brain had been controlling the left hand initially. There's also examples in MS where patients will, instead of using a couple specific brain areas like they had in the past to control a task, because those are damaged, they'll have to call upon more widespread. They'll use much wider regions of the brain, much more bandwidth in the brain, and that can actually contribute to fatigue, and it can make it difficult to perform multiple tasks at once because more of the brain is having to be used in order to complete more simple tasks. There's also some really interesting examples. A great book I'll recommend at this point also it's called The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Doidge. Great examples in there, one of which is a study that he describes looking at monkeys who they were able to actually map the parts of the monkeys' brains. The scientists were able to tell exactly which part of the brain was monitoring sensation and function of the fingers, and they found the map area for the brain area for the middle finger and the fingers right beside it. They cut the nerve then that went to the middle finger, and the brain area that monitors that middle finger was no longer getting any inputs. It was dormant, and they wanted to see what happened. And they found out that the brain really, really does obey this use it or lose it principle, where the brain, where it was dormant, where it wasn't getting any input, that brain area actually got taken over by the ones right beside it. So for the finger to the left and to the finger to the right, the brain area, corresponding brain area to the left, corresponding brain area to the right, those took over that dormant brain area and actually, in a very short period of time, made changes in this mapping of the brain that people thought for forever was hardwired and couldn't be changed. And it happened almost impossibly quickly, or at least surprisingly quickly. So it shows, one, the potential for neuroplasticity, and two, really shows this use it or lose it principle. The third type of neuroplasticity is learned disuse, and that is the downside of neuroplasticity, and it is an example of that use it or lose it. So looking at Wendy's situation, if she hadn't been doing that activity, that serious physical therapy and that workout group, she would have fallen into the same trap as this use it or lose it situation, just like what happened with that monkey's brain. And when that part of the brain was no longer getting input from that finger and it got taken over, if she had not been using her legs because she was confined to a wheelchair, she couldn't use her legs nearly as much or as effectively. If she stopped trying to use them altogether, she would have further lost the ability to use her legs, and it would have taken that new lower level of function, made it even lower. So thankfully she avoided that. So in terms of neuroplasticity, big picture now, we know the why we're interested in it, because we want to help people like Wendy restore function. We know what it is. We know that we're trying to help the nervous system either repair or find strategies to compensate, and we know that it's the adaptations are going to be specific to the actions and the environmental signals and inputs that are being experienced. Now we have to talk about the how, about how to actually tap into this power of neuroplasticity. And there's a few main prerequisites that are vitally important, that are absolutely necessary for neuroplasticity to happen. The first is the amount of work. The amount of work that it takes is astounding. And in order to really comprehend that, I have to invite you to think about an Olympic athlete, an athlete who's attempting to win a gold medal, and think about the training that he or she is going to be going through. It's not just a half hour here and there. It's hours of focused, deliberate effort, not just one day, but every day, and not just for a few weeks, but for many months or for years. That's the amount of effort that it takes to achieve that level of mastery for an athlete, and that's the amount of input and effort that it takes to drive significant neuroplastic changes to remaster something like walking for Wendy, or to improve function and give the nervous system enough input so that it really is compelled to rebuild. So prerequisite number one is that amount of work. Number two is the specificity of that work. If we're trying to help Wendy learn to walk again, she actually has to get those reps, think about hundreds of thousands of reps, that Olympic athlete level. She has to get those, and those have to be reps in activities that are relevant to walking. She has to work on the strength of her legs. She has to work on her balance. She has to work on coordinating her legs and hips. If we're spending time manipulating objects or working on her penmanship with her hands, that's not going to carry over to her gait and her walking. So we actually have to be specific. We have to be working the right areas in relevant tasks. The third prerequisite is support. The body has to be healthy enough to actually support. There has to be enough energy to fuel the basics that are needed for survival, and then have enough energy left over to do these hundreds of thousands of reps that Wendy's going to need to drive these changes, and have enough energy left over even after that to be able to recover from that, to rebuild the muscles and other tissues that were challenged, and to remodel the nervous system, to remyelinate pathways, or to create new patterns and new pathways and these detours or these compensatory strategies. So there's a lot that goes into this. A couple caveats: that the degree of neuroplastic opportunity or capacity does depend, to some degree on age, does depend on the severity and the location of damage, and it does depend on overall health. And like we talked about, that physiological support, the body needs to have that robust enough foundation of health in order to make these changes. The opportunity does depend on health, and that's where, particularly for MS patients or anyone with any sort of autoimmune condition, where we recommend the Wahls protocol, and we've seen that can make the greatest impact on moving the needle to create that robust foundation of good health. Let's talk next about proven strategies for creating neuroplastic changes. So the first is physical therapy. And like Wendy experienced, physical therapy generally is enough to maintain a level of function, and that's important. Just maintaining and not falling into that downward spiral of learned disuse. There's value in that. In order to create positive change, physical therapy just has to be done in very significant volumes, like that Olympic athlete training hours a day, working towards that hundreds of thousands of repetitions of each movement, each skill that they're attempting to master. Visual motor training is another proven strategy, and one study that is in the references here shows MS patients and controls, non-MS patients, who were doing a task where they were squeezing a dynamometer, basically a hand grip sensor, and their grip, as they gripped it tighter, it would cause a bar on the computer screen to rise. As they let off the pressure, the bar would come back down, and they'd have to match another. So there's a visual task, seeing the bar, cognitive task of determining where that bar is, and then sending a signal to create a motor task to try to match that grip pressure. And they found some really cool things in this study. They found that the MS patients and control patients both improved in just the first session. So even with significant damage, the MS patients could learn very quickly. And over just 2 weeks of doing this an hour a day, so it's enough practice. They're building toward that volume. And it's specific because they're getting better at this task that they're practicing. In just 2 weeks, meeting those prerequisites, they started to see significant changes in their brain. So for some of the patients who had this crossover in their brain, where instead of the right brain controlling the left hand, the left brain had started controlling the left hand, they started to see more activity in the right brain, the opposite side, the correct side, started to see more activity there. And in the MS patients who had this situation where they had more widespread brain areas taking over instead of the specific areas that should have been controlling that activity, they started to reduce the number of brain areas that they needed in order to perform that activity. So great summary statement here. The authors of the study said that even in patients who had significant impairments, they were able to see meaningful performance improvements. So really, really cool finding. Shows that even in spite of significant impairments, they can make progress.
If you're ready to supercharge your practice, listen to this. Garrett and Team NeuFit have just released a new online course entitled Introduction to the NeuFit Method. In this detailed 8-hour course, you'll gain mastery of the fundamental techniques in our practice, including muscle testing and activations, nerve glides, and joint articulations. You'll also get introduced to our patented direct current stimulation device, the Newbie, an incredible machine that's empowered professionals just like you to help their patients heal, adapt, and grow faster than they ever thought possible. To learn more, go to www.neu.fit/learn. And now back to the show.
Next is constraint therapy, and constraint therapy is a really cool strategy for helping people get to those hundreds of thousands of reps that they need, and to do the specific nature of the task that they're working on. So there's a picture here of a gentleman who had a stroke that impaired his left hand, and he normally in daily life would use his right hand to feed himself, to brush his teeth, to do all the things that he needs to do, and he would fall into that trap likely of getting worse, his left hand getting worse because of learned disuse, because he's constantly compensating with the right hand. And so what constraint therapy does is it puts a mitt on his right hand to prevent him from using it, so he has to use his left. So it helps him build up the number of reps that he needs to make that progress and work towards those hundreds of thousands of reps that he needs. And there's a couple of statements here from different studies that talk about how constraint therapy can drive significant neuroplastic changes in both the structure and function, and it often leads to improved activity in the opposite side of the brain, the correct side for controlling hand movements. The next slide here talks about constraint therapy for one study, for example, about MS patients who use constraint therapy on their lower body. And on their legs, if someone's working on walking, you can't just put a brace on one leg and prevent them from using that leg. But what you can do is either intentionally focus on loading the impaired leg more by doing stepping or working around obstacles or things like that. You can also use what's shown in the image here, a anti-gravity treadmill, or assisted treadmill that's going to support some of the body weight. So instead of having to load 100% of that person's body weight, they're just having to support, say, 50% of their body weight, or it can be dialed down or up based on to give the appropriate level of challenge for that patient. And so in this study, they found that a few hours a day, remember it takes hours and hours and hours of focused practice, and 3 to 4 hours a day of gait training for MS patients actually allowed them to improve function in just a couple weeks. Actually, a 3-week study here, they were able to make improvements, and those improvements lasted many months. So it's a big deal that they're able to start making these changes, and they're doing it because they're getting enough work, that amount of work is there, and it's specific work. They're working on their walking in order to get better at walking. They're working the exact pathways that they need. Another strategy that helps people get specific practice and specific inputs is robotic exoskeletons. And so if you imagine if you're an MS patient and you can't move your arm at all, or you don't have enough strength to lift it, how are you going to get hundreds of thousands of repetitions of reaching and manipulating objects if you can't even get one? Obviously, it seems impossible because you can't even get one. How are you going to work towards those hundreds of thousands? And so these strategies use robotic exoskeletons, where if I was doing this, I would have an exoskeleton that actually would move my arm in the position or in the range and direction that I'm intending to move, and then I start to get those first few reps with the robot guiding me, and then eventually I start to learn it and get better at it and can wean off of that more and more. There's another example here. There's an image of a Locomat, which is an exoskeleton for the legs that can actually be used for walking. So the MS patient can step into it and can actually start to get reps in walking and start to work towards those hundreds and hundreds of thousands of quality repetitions that they need in order to improve their walking. And eventually they can, hopefully, start to wean off of that. And these are accessible in specialized PT and OT clinics that work specifically with patients recovering from neurological injuries and challenges and conditions. So these are getting more available. Based on these strategies that are proven and have evidence behind them and are getting some really compelling outcomes, there's a couple things that we can glean from them. One is they all meet the specificity criteria. Two, they all meet the quantity criteria, where they're allowing patients to amass a significant amount of work and work towards that critical threshold that they need in order to make changes. So these are strategies that allow them to get that, to meet those prerequisites that they need. And a couple other things that we'll mention here. We don't want to forget about the support, following the Wahls protocol, being healthy, keeping inflammation down, having enough nutrients and raw materials to make changes. And we also have to mention at this point sleep. Sleep is vitally important, particularly deep sleep and REM sleep. Deep sleep is more first half of the night, more about replenishing energy in the body and the brain, rebuilding the structures that got challenged during all of those hours of focused work. And then REM sleep, vitally important for neuroplasticity, usually more in the second half of the night. And that's when the nervous system actually remodels, makes new pathways, takes short-term memories and condenses them into long-term memories, and makes many of these changes that actually are the underlying mechanical changes of neuroplasticity. So sleep, vitally important as well. In addition to this landscape of accepted neuroplasticity inducing techniques, we are going to add the NeuFit method. And NeuFit has allowed us to harness the power of neuroplasticity in some very compelling ways. In the image here it's a picture of a gentleman named Grant Corgan, and although he doesn't have MS, he did have a spinal cord injury that paralyzed him from the waist down about 10 years ago. And for the last 10 years, he hasn't been able, for example, to use his hamstrings. And he's in this very difficult spot where he knows that he needs hundreds of thousands of reps to really retrain those hamstrings to turn back on, and yet he can't even do that first one. So how on earth is he going to get to hundreds of thousands of reps if he can't even get one? Well, he wasn't able to make any progress in 10 years doing very intense and sophisticated and consistent therapy. And then using the newbie, as it's shown in this picture here, we were able to identify the exact pathways that we needed to stimulate to get those hamstrings back online and provide, in addition to working specifically, able to provide the amount of work. We're able to send those signals over and over and over and over again and get the equivalent amount of several sessions of work in just a few minutes on the machine. And so in a couple sessions a week over less than 2 months, we were able to reach that critical threshold and get enough stimulation, enough input, drive those neuroplastic changes to where he, for the first time in 10 years, was able to contract his hamstring and do a leg curl. He was able to lift his leg up, able to actually turn that hamstring muscle on. And he was blown away at how quickly those changes happened. how is that possible? When he was putting in 10 years of consistent work, how just a few sessions with something like the newbie can make that level of difference? Well, part of it has to do with the difference between direct current and alternating current, and how that direct current allows us to make a direct input line into the nervous system. With alternating current, as that signal volleys back and forth, it alternates direction, it actually triggers a few things to happen. One is this kind of confusing mix between motor and sensory signals, and it often is limited by actually muscle contraction. So not the case with Grant, because he couldn't contract it. It wasn't enough contraction yet at all, but it actually creates this signal where if he had been able to move, it would have caused muscles on both sides of his joint to co-contract and fight against each other. And he'd be training his body to move like as if he was driving a car, hitting the throttle and the brake pedal at the same time. It's just very inefficient and wastes energy and is not a good recipe for movement at all. Even though he wasn't able to move, he's still getting that confusing signal into the nervous system. So he's getting more of this protective, confusing input, not able to create enough of the meaningful input that he needs. Whereas that direct current can go preferentially more into the sensory and afferent side of his nervous system to in a very powerful way start building towards that critical threshold of inputs that he needs in order to start making these changes. And it allows us to do this 3-step process that we do, where we can actually send that direct current scan around on the body, send it in from different areas to identify exactly where we need to work, where he needed those particular inputs, and then sending that signal allows us to reset very quickly those pathways. And that's, in this case, just to build up enough reps and the critical mass of those inputs in order to reach those thresholds much more quickly and efficiently. And then finally, that often leads to breakthroughs. So Grant was able, in less than 2 months of just a few sessions a week, to make more progress than he had in the previous 10 years. And likewise, Wendy saw some significant breakthroughs as well. So Wendy, she came to see us in Austin, spent a week with us. She did 2 sessions a day, Monday through Friday. And during that time, some really cool things started to happen. So she did her first 2 sessions Monday. She came in Tuesday morning, and before that first session of the second day, she said, "Hey, look what I can do." And for the first time in a couple years, she's sitting in her wheelchair and she's lifted her left leg. She straightened her left knee, lifted up her left foot and lower leg, and had enough strength in her quad to actually create that extension. And she was smiling ear to ear as she showed us that. At the end of the second day, her husband and I were actually bending down we were going to put on her socks and put on her shoes, tie her shoes for her like we had done the previous 3 sessions. And she said, hey, wait a second, guys. And she actually bent down and put on her own shoes and socks for the first time in a few years. And she had been too stiff and weak to even get down there, but in just a few sessions she was starting to see these changes so that she could go down and actually put on her own shoes and socks. One of the things that she told us at the beginning of the week, she has bigger goals, but she did mention that she'd be happy if she could just take a few steps holding her husband's hand as like a good intermediate step. And Friday at the end of her last session, that actually happened. And she had been holding on to some supports and doing some squats with the newbie on. And at the end of the session, we turned the machine off, took the pads off, and she signaled her husband to come over. She grabbed his hand and she walked a few steps to her wheelchair. And we in the office we were all in tears, and it was just a profoundly moving experience. And and she of course wanted to continue her progress, so she ended up taking a newbie device home with her, working with our team remotely. And since then, she's gotten some new, even bigger goals. And her new goal is to walk her son down the aisle at his wedding. And she actually was prepared to do that last month. She's ready to do it, but she couldn't do it because of coronavirus. The wedding got delayed, so she's planning to do that in October. I have a video here of her walking. So for those of you who are watching on the video, you'll be able to see that. And while you're watching this, I'll also mention that she is now actually planning to take her test this week for her driver's license. So because of her significant impairment, she had to give up her driver's license a few years ago, and she's now at the point where she's ready to take her test this week. She's driving again, and she's ready to take her test to regain her driver's license. She's ready to get rid of her caregiver who's been coming and helping her out at home. She's made such tremendous progress, and you can see here in this video that she's walking faster, more confidently, far longer. She went literally just a year ago, was in a wheelchair, couldn't take any steps, and now she's walking up and down this sidewalk from the car to a doctor's appointment quickly, confidently, without any hesitation, and she's just come such a long way. It's been an amazing year, and she's very excited to continue her progress. And I hope that from Wendy's story and from these other studies and other strategies that you start to see the amazing opportunity and the power that we have to make changes, the potential of neuroplasticity, how profound it is, and how even in the face of considerable impairment and disability, there is still hope and there is still an opportunity to make progress. So we'll have here in the notes a list of the references if you want to look at any of these studies, any of these papers. There's some great references in there if you want to see firsthand what they have to say. And just thank you so much for tuning into this. And I really hope the message resonated with you, and that you start to really appreciate the potential that we all have to make tremendous changes, to heal, to adapt, and to grow.
Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review and be sure to subscribe to stay up to date as we release future episodes.